This time last year, the death of Michael Brown changed the history of St. Louis and ignited a movement across the nation. This past weekend galvanized many, angered some, and we can't forget that August 9th is a date that one family will always mourn. 1 year later, have things actually changed? Tonight we look forward with a co-chair and two members of the Ferguson Commission asking, what are the issues vital to St. Louis? So stay tuned. Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned. A year after the police shooting of Michael Brown, it can be hard to know how far we've come. On Sunday, Brown's family and others held a series of events marking the anniversary, peaceful events, including a silent march, but the day ended with gunfire. Multiple gunshots not far from protesters and police. An 18-year-old was critically wounded when he was shot by police after they say he fired on them first. Before that, many public events focused on bringing the community together and bringing awareness to social issues that have become more a part of the public conversation in the last year. Outside the 9 network studios in the Public Media Commons, a preview of a new documentary called Whose Streets highlighted protesters turned activists working to bring equality to St. Louis. Marches originated at the site where Michael Brown was killed. Public art exhibits raised awareness of the issues, and panel discussions took a hard look at the state of the region. Tonight, we look forward, asking, what's vital to St. Louis? Joining us tonight are, as we said, 2 members and 1 co-chair of the Ferguson Commission. Let me introduce everyone to you first. Rasheen Aldridge Jr., welcome back to the show 2 weeks in a row. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Brittany Packnett, with not just the Ferguson Commissioner, but also with Teach for America, Executive Director here in St. Louis, and Reverend Starsky Wilson, the co-chairman of the Ferguson Commission. Okay, before we dive in here, it's important that we bring in part of the conversation we had earlier in the week. Every Tuesday, we have a Twitter chat that informs this conversation. Let's take a look at what you had to say this week.
In Tuesday night's Stay Tuned Twitter chat, we discussed what's vital to St. Louis. The police shooting death of Michael Brown Jr. has made the systemic injustices of America prevalent to more citizens than this time last year. And for those in the chat Tuesday, the time to act is now. The Stay Tuned tweets have noted the change in municipal courts before. But the issues plaguing our schools, law enforcement, and economic inequity are begging for attention. Folks felt like, as a whole, we're not all on the same page when it comes to addressing injustices and realities of others. But when asked how to address the issues, our chat participants had plenty of ideas. The change that is happening is positive. But change takes more time than chat participants would like. Want to be part of our next chat? Follow us on Twitter at StayTunedSTL and join the conversation on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. with the hashtag StayTunedSTL.
This is an example, I should mention, of that the 9 network is committed to continuing coverage of issues vital to our region, both on air and online. The Twitter chat, as we said, takes place every Tuesday, so join us with hashtag StayTunedSTL, and our thanks to John Alexander, a member of the team, for putting that together for us. So thank you, John. Okay, how are you feeling after this past weekend? Let's go there before we pick up a couple of things from the Twitter chat. How do you feel, Brittany?
Pretty exhausted. We were talking about this before the broadcast began. You know, I was very hopeful that this weekend would not be one of nostalgia, but would be one of action. And I think that we saw a lot of positive, urgent, important action on the part of activists, members of the community, continuing the dialogue, continuing to act, continuing to push for urgent change. And yet we saw some reactions, unfortunately, from law enforcement that I do believe were heavy-handed. I myself was pepper sprayed one night, and so when we think about being in the middle of August 2015, it feels far too much like August 2014. And that, quite frankly, is very exhausting, but it is a reminder of how much work there is to be done and how we just can't give up.
Just strictly on the police-community relations, or how are you feeling overall? Or did that overshadow everything for you? Did you feel, however you felt you were treated while protesting, I gather?
Sure. Mm-hmm. You know, and it certainly didn't overshadow it, right? Like I said, it was a reminder of the urgency of now. But what I do know is that we've seen, gosh, over 52, 53 weeks now, people continue to interact, continue to engage, and really come forward with a lot of solutions, not just in the area of police and community relations, but in education, in healthcare, in racial healing. And so, you know, I continue to be hopeful because people are continuing to push for change and continuing to be active. And you know, we know that on the Twitter chat, people said that change doesn't come fast enough, so we need to keep pushing, certainly.
Were any of you frustrated? You know, the shots fired that we mentioned at the top of the show, I was there, the police have said as much, that this was not you know, directly related to protest activities. It was a couple hundred yards away. What was your reaction to that? You talk about you didn't like some of the police tactics. What did you think of some of the public actions?
Yeah, so I think, so I'll try to answer both questions together. So I feel inspired and encouraged, quite frankly, from this past weekend. Inspired at the example of Leslie McSpadden and Michael Brown Sr., who have found purpose over the course of this last year and have begun to engage to draw attention and awareness to these issues. And throughout the weekend, we saw forums and dialogues, conversations that brought awareness to the various angles of the things that we've seen over the course of the last year. We had a pretty significant meeting ourselves with the commission in order to talk about and to prioritize some issues for going forward. And we've seen the public significantly engage in that process, in as much as we've seen the public engage in organizing, activism in the streets and advocacy in Jefferson City and City Hall, respective places of governance in this community. I think that's, quite frankly, inspiring. And so as we talk about a public that's still having this conversation, we recognize that there are people on all levels of the conversation, and we recognize first and foremost that there are young people who have been traumatized by the conversation, and more than the conversation, the matters, the issues that have been exposed that we still have not moved quickly enough for me or for the folks on the Twitter chat about. And so we see young people still acting out of that trauma and out of that pain. We see that from those who are on the ground, and quite frankly, you know, it's helpful for us to recall what the police have said in this moment and what the media did not say immediately. The media continued to ask about how folks felt about the shooting and continued to connect the narrative of the shooting to the narrative of the protest, even though the police immediately said they didn't have anything to do with one another. So quite frankly, as we think about those shootings,
even in the way I just asked the question now, do you think?
Not as much in the way you asked the question, but I think it's important to point out that what we saw is violence between young people that we see on the streets of our community every single day. What we see is that this just happened to be a time and a place where people were gathered in the collective grief, mourning, and remembrance of Michael Brown, and that same violence, which has pervaded our community for 365 days and the 365 days before that, somehow all of a sudden created a state of emergency. So we need to be thoughtful about the fact that that type of violence was happening in the community well before, but with the nation's eyes upon St. Louis, all of a sudden it was a state of emergency. So let's remember that there are over 100 shootings in that way in our community in this year already. 100
murders, 100 homicides,
exactly, right?
120 some odd.
So you know, so I raised the question that Hands Up United has asked: which state of emergency? That state of emergency was called well before our county executive began to move. It was called before August 16th last year when the governor called a state of emergency in St. Louis County. And so those kinds of issues are the ones that the Twitter chat is talking about, the intractable issues of economic inequity, of educational inequity that pervade child well-being and economic mobility in our region. And in that way, there's still much work to do. And that's why I'm inspired that so many people were engaged, such diverse crowds of people were engaged this weekend in a sustained conversation about the change that we must push forward in our region.
I see you nodding. How are you feeling?
I mean, I was definitely coming out of the weekend, like Starchy said, inspired and ready for more, energized and ready to do more. It was definitely a bittersweet weekend. Even though we lost Michael Brown a year ago, this weekend was more about just losing Michael Brown. It was about bringing people back together. I mean, the theme of the whole weekend was United We Fight. And bringing people back together and remember why we came to the streets on August 9th to fight. This wasn't just a weekend of protest of which most people seen. It was a weekend of having conversation. It was a weekend of training. It was a weekend of education, educating each other on how to continue to move forward in this fight. But at the same time, the bitter part of it is because we did lose a brother. It took for us to lose Michael Brown, for not only Ferguson to wake up, but for the world, our elected officials, people in positions of power to say it's time to do something. And like Brittany said, a year later, we still continue to see the aggressiveness of the police. The next day after the shooting, when people took to the streets to peacefully protest, it was still more arrests as people were just on the sidewalk protesting. There was still very aggressive tactics from the St. Louis County Police Department. So what have they learned? And it doesn't seem like much. It doesn't seem like much.
And maybe that goes back to what you're saying about the way things are looked at from a larger view, the state of emergency, because I know that they would probably say that they had people shot the night before and they were trying to prevent that. That would be one thing we would probably hear from the police.
Well, the question is, why wasn't there a state of emergency on on Friday night or Thursday night or Wednesday night? There are people shot in the county, in North County, almost every day.
That's right.
I mean, we've had those situations happen in the city where we've gotten up in the morning, unfortunately, and seen 3 shootings the night before. No state of emergency. There weren't CNN cameras.
That's right.
On Wednesday. There weren't, this is the difference. We got to own up to that. We got to own up to the victory laps, quite frankly, that some of our civic leaders have been having over the course of the last 2 weeks, when reports come out that say, well, we haven't had any economic loss and we haven't lost money from conventions, because quite frankly, that's what we really learned from Cincinnati. We learned from Cincinnati is try to avoid the economic boycott. So when we come upon the anniversary, the headlines out of some of our civic leadership circles become the headlines that we haven't sustained the kind of economic loss. Well, our murder rate is higher. We're losing more young people in the streets. We still have we're still maintaining and managing a system. We've not seen implementation of SB 5. We haven't seen police departments start the process of certification yet. We haven't seen movements toward the reduction yet in the percentage of minor traffic violations that make up cities' budgets, but we haven't lost anything on conventions.
And that's my point about nostalgia, right? So it is far too easy to enter these kinds of moments and have a moment of remembrance only, which is important, right? Because Michael Brown's life should not have been lost for us, as Rasheen said, to have this moment and to have this movement in our country. And yet, a lot of times that nostalgia turns into self-congratulations. And so we decide that because enough hasn't gone wrong, or the things that we expected to go wrong didn't go wrong, that somehow we've made enough progress, right? But the consent decree that the DOJ has put forward to the Ferguson City Council still has not been agreed to. And we're here, sitting here a year later, and there are a number of incontrovertible facts in that report that the city of Ferguson really has had the opportunity over the last 365 plus days to say, we will stand by this and we will make sure that these things happen urgently, to see the kinds of reductions in violence and abuse and oppression that we've seen consistently in Ferguson and more broadly across the St. Louis region. This is an opportunity to actually advance things, not just by having a conversation, but by taking action. And so seeing action taken on things like the consent decree are critical to making sure that we're not just getting caught in this moment of patting one another on the back that we made it another year.
Speaking of CNN cameras, the PBS NewsHour was in town, and we had a chance to talk to their national correspondent and weekend anchor, Hari Srinivasan. Here's what he had to say about how the rest of the world views what's going on here.
What Ferguson gave America an opportunity to do was to start looking at underlying tensions that might have been here for a long time, but that were just sort of exposed. In St. Louis, around St. Louis, you guys are probably tired of it. You probably don't necessarily want to associate this town with one specific incident. But for the rest of the country, the rest of the world, it was part of a chain of events that's happened, maybe Eric Garner before that, and then all the way through, right? That started to pick at the underlying causes of social injustice, racial inequality, existing tensions between communities, and really how a community manages to get through this. What Ferguson did was catalyze a much larger conversation, and that conversation has actually carried momentum from tragic event to event to event. There's an opportunity here for us not to look at Ferguson as, look at what this city did wrong, look at what this town did wrong, look at what's wrong with this region, but really like Ferguson could have happened in 100 different places around the United States, 1,000 different places around the United States. So what have they done to learn from it? What can we do to prevent it from happening?
We still have to get to a couple of the tweets we saw from John's piece earlier, but here's one that's coming in right now from STL Social Group, directly for the commission. Call to actions. The call to actions, there's 200 that you guys started with, and you've whittled them down, or focused them, maybe a better word, to approximately 30. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've been talking about them. We'll hear more over the next month or so. Why do the calls to action, why don't they have a deadline? Are they too lengthy? Is there anyone being held accountable for them? Give me your thoughts on that. I'll pitch to the co-chair first.
Yeah, so these calls to action, and they're all readily available right now, all 200 plus, the STL Positive Change. We encourage people to go to the website to learn, to familiarize themselves to those calls to action. And so for those who do that, they'll recognize that not only are the calls there, and some of them are pretty lengthy, and some of them are now bundles, so you got kind of categories. But they have different accountable bodies. Those bodies move at different paces, and so timelines.
That's actually a column.
Expect.
When you see it
Right.
on the far right of the column, it says, what is the accountable body?
Exactly. So those bodies move at different paces. You got the legislature that's responsible for some things, and of course, you need legislative cycles to go forward. We're pleased that our report is going to come out in September. Conversations about the pre-filing of bills usually happen between September and December 1st. So there's timing to prepare some of the things to get them ready for the coming legislative session. So timing really has to do with those things. What we expect and anticipate is that we'll see situations like what we saw, as a matter of fact, last week, where the governor has an opportunity as one accountable body, and we hold that this report is to the community as well as the governor. As one person who has some accountability, the governor has seen the calls to action that work their way through the Citizen Law Enforcement Working Group that Brittany and Dan Isom co-chaired as it relates to policing, police training and continuing education, asking for increased training in the areas of use of force, use of force or tactical training, culturally competent policing or anti-bias training, and officer wellness. It uses that as a framework to say, yes, this is right. We called for it in April. Last week he came and said, yes, this is right on. And when he appointed new members of the Post Commission, he noted to them very specifically these three categories. He asked for increased training as aligned with the call, and he gave them a deadline. To say by December 1st, we want to see these things come forward. So a lot of those timelines have to be set by the various accountable bodies. And they have to work at their pace. And quite frankly, what we'll be releasing on September 15th is a report that seeks to create some narrative around these, make the case for them to the public, and invite the public to engage in the process of civic engagement to hold those accountable bodies accountable. So part of the work and how quickly they move will have to do with the urgency to the citizenry.
Is that fast enough for you guys? Is that fast enough? I'm thinking of a bad analogy perhaps, but of my own, say, professional career, and I look back at how impatient I was when I was younger. Mm-hmm. It's a little embarrassing, but it may have gotten things done. I don't know. Is this fast enough for the young people who are in the streets?
I mean, I don't think it's not fast enough, because these are issues that have been going on for years and years and years. These are issues that a community continues to face on a day-to-day basis. So after a while, it's this, you need this change quickly, and that's something that I can say. Once September come, I think the commission has really focused on that. You know, 3 things that we are looking at when it comes to our recommendations: is it transformative, is it unflinching, and is it urgent? And I think the community is going to look at some of these recommendations and say, this is definitely transformative, this is something urgent that we need to act on, and this is a recommendation that's not scared, it's unflinching, it's something that the community is asking for, not elected officials that are trying to water it down, but all the recommendations that have been put forward are from the community members. It's not fast enough, but I think these recommendations that we have, the commission that's going to put forward, are going to change things quicker than you even see policy from lawmakers. I mean, these are some bold recommendations that we're putting forward that should have honestly happened a long time ago.
Yeah. Like, what is bold that comes to mind first for you?
I mean, I think one of the most important things that comes to mind is the need for independent and external prosecutions and investigations of officer-involved deaths, so in-custody deaths, officer-involved shootings. When we talk about building trust and legitimacy in the community, that is the first and most important factor in community and law enforcement relations, right? So if the police recognize that they derive their power from the community and the community feels that they can actually trust law enforcement and the systems that surround law enforcement, then we can actually see things progress. And part of that is needs to be the perception of impartiality, right? That we can actually say, if this is going to move forward, if a tragedy does occur, which we hope it doesn't, but if it does occur, then I can actually trust and believe that the systems and the people propping up those systems have my best interests at heart and are not out there doing things in their own interest, right? And that's something that we know the community has struggled with. We struggled with it in the wake of Michael Brown's death. We've continued to struggle with it. We've seen communities all across the country struggle with it. So that is something that was in the president's report. It's in the Ferguson Commission report. And I think that that is one of those bold and unflinching pieces. But to this question about rate of change, you know, when several activists, Rasheen and myself included, sat in the Oval Office with President Obama on December the 1st, we had a longer than expected conversation with him. And one of the things we talked about was the quote from Dr. King about how long the arc of history is, but that it bends toward justice. And I have to put my faith and my hope in the fact that it does bend toward justice, but we recognize that it has taken centuries for us to arrive at the point that we have right now, and that, you know, oppression and systemic racism has been built over hundreds of years. And so it's going to take more than just 1 year to dismantle those things and to replace them with more equitable systems, which is why even if we move with the most urgency in the world, we're still not going to see things change overnight. And so I think it's both important to be urgent and realistic and understand the arc of history and to have faith in that. So I'm hopeful that really, I do believe bold and unflinching recommendations in the commission report will not just be there to hold those accountable bodies accountable, but also act as leverage for the community to say, this is what we said, it's right here codified for you in black and white, and so we're going to continue to put pressure on you from all angles to make sure these things happen.
You mentioned you're sitting with the president. That was something you most likely didn't expect
no, I definitely did not.
13 months ago. So to a tweet we had earlier in the week, this is from Casey Hinton. Is there going to be much movement on major issues, or excuse me, major areas of racial justice without federal push?
You know, I think when we look at the scope and sequence of history, communities of color, marginalized communities have always needed the federal government to step in and intervene. We think about the desegregation of schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. We needed the federal government to intervene.
Hearts and Minds didn't make that change.
That's right. Hearts and Minds didn't make that change, and so we needed the government to stand up for people's rights until people's hearts and minds caught up. And so it will always be necessary for the federal government to protect the interests and the needs of marginalized communities. It's part of the reason why this movement is continuing to have a lot of conversations and continuing to put pressure on presidential candidates, right? So we are recognizing that whomever is president, Democrat, Republican, Independent, that you will be someone who is in charge of our fate and who will have everything to do with whether or not the federal government continues to intervene on our behalf and to protect the interests of marginalized people. And so keeping that pressure up will be necessary. And I think that that question on Twitter is the right one to be asking, and it's the right one for us to continue to be asking of candidates.
This is why it's very important that the Moral Monday actions started at the courthouse and were led by clergy. The role of the government in a biblical framework, a tradition that's shared in the Old Testament by Jews and Christians, is that ultimately the role of the government, the role of the king, is to care for the widows and the orphans. That the responsibility of authority and power is to care for people who are at the margins of society. And so we go to these places. That is what government is to do. It's ultimately to serve to care for those who are marginalized by society. And so in the same way, this historical reference that Brittany made quite appropriately is a call on the Department of Justice to say, you have documented these issues, and it is within your authority and responsibility to care for those who have been documentedly discriminated by police departments across the country, in Ferguson and Cincinnati and other places. And so this is your work to do. And quite frankly, if you do not do this work, then you fail the task of governments. This is the task of governance in America, is the task of governance everywhere in our broad understanding in this way. So yes, absolutely need the federal government to bring its weight to bear. Quite frankly, I don't understand. I don't think you can count to 4 domestic issues that presidential candidates could be talking about, that Americans want to hear about, without talking about criminalization of blackness, poverty, and youth in America. And that comes in the form of the criminal justice system writ large and policing very specifically. So I don't see how you have a presidential debate and don't have a robust conversation about it, because there aren't 2 domestic issues that you put in front of it in the national dialogue right now.
We just have about 30 seconds. It's flown by, but I want to ask you a question, Rasheen. This is from the Scholarship Foundation on Twitter this week. What will ensure authentic youth engagement going forward? How do they stay hopeful? What will be required to persevere? So how do they stay hopeful?
I mean, looking back this last year, it has been tough. It isn't something where you think, these young people are just continuing to come to the streets because they like it. But one, personally for me, is the relationships, the individuals that are like around these tables, the relationships that have been built for the last 365 days that people do not see, continuing to stay unified, continuing to, if I have an issue, go to Brittany. If I feel like I need some type of help, going to Starsky or other young people in the movement.
We got to leave it there. We'll continue talking online. Until next week, stay tuned. We just staying with it for 1 second. A little bonus time here. Brittany didn't expect that she would be with the president. Rasheen probably didn't expect he was going to be on a gubernatorial commission. Did you expect that you might voluntarily go to jail? And jail is probably the wrong word. Be detained at a federal courthouse. How about that?
Yeah. I mean, at some point in this movement, these are the moments that you're going to have to kind of face, and without it dramatizes the challenge that we face. Quite frankly, it's the reason why we do this, and you can't follow the kind of leaders that we have seen grow up in this movement without emulating and imitating their actions and drawing attention to situations
Personal
the way
sacrifice.
with that kind of sacrifice. I mean, the stakes are raised on what leadership really is, and my work in this didn't start on November 18th. So I was with young people, following them in the street, caring for them until 3 in the morning by standing on the police line because police sometimes acted a little better when there was clergy there. So you can't stand and see all that and be exposed to that and expect people to continue to make the sacrifice for your suffering.
And speaking of the rate of change, I mean, both of you had been on this show prior to August 9th. Are things moving at a different pace? Are things in the public conversation in a way that you would have expected? I don't know. Maybe my standards are too low.
I don't know if I would have expected it, but I do think that the rate of change has increased, right? I mean, there was recent polling saying that white Americans would now say that structural racism, more white Americans than ever before would say that structural racism is an issue in America. But I think both the points that Starsky and Rasheen just made really bring this back to what is central for me, which is love, right? People often view our movement as hating the police or hating entire systems of government, and that's really not what it's based on. It's about love for one another. It's about love for ourselves, our dignity. When we talk about hope for young people, we have to show them love, right, and embrace all of the power that they bring into these spaces and support and love them. And so, when we talk about that at the end of our actions, when we talk about that in our meetings, when we talk about the relationships and the family that has been built over the last 365 days, a very diverse family that's been built, it's really about love and the decision to ensure that people respect our dignity and that I can look at you you and you can look at me and we can see each other's humanity and behave as such. So yeah, I think that's the most important piece of all of this.
What I didn't expect a year ago is that on Twitter, Brittany would call me her woe.
Wait, I gotta learn something new. Yeah, I gotta.
Yes.
Like,
okay.
that's the movement,
So you
right?
have to ask Drake what a woe is. Woe is short for woody.
I'm sorry, I'm being told "whoa" in my ear right now.
But Starsky is my woe. Rasheen is my woe. So many people that I never would have known a year ago. Those are all of our woes. That's our family, right? And we are in this until we can ensure that this family is continuously respected, that our lives are secure, and that we can live this American dream that we've heard so much about.
We'll leave it there. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I didn't pick on you in the